What's up, guys? Today is a very exciting day for me because I'm going to be breaking down this epic transition that I made a while back. Now, going through a lot of the comments online, many people thought they knew exactly how this was done, and the technique I saw most people talk about was masking, but in reality, masking was only about 5% of the entire process. There was way more that went into this. So what I'm really stoked on is that I screen recorded the original process of when I first made this transition. This is huge for me and for you guys because it shows the entire process from start to finish, including all the times that I f***ed up. And the reason I think this is going to be very beneficial to you guys is because you'll see that sometimes your ideas don't always go as planned. You know, you might run into issues, you might have problems with the way things are going, but the important thing is to not give up at first sign of failure, but to keep pushing forwards and looking for solutions. I can't tell you guys how much of my work probably wouldn't have made it to the internet if I gave up the first time I failed. So when things don't always go as planned, it's important to keep pushing forward and looking for other solutions because that's what's going to separate the winners from the losers. So sometimes my transitions are pre-planned. I'll have an idea and then go out and execute. But actually most of the time the ideas come up in post when I'm scrubbing through my footage. So in this case, I was making a video for MusicBed and I was just scrubbing through a bunch of different timelines and came across this one clip that I hadn't used before. It was a shot of Chelsea riding her surfboard over a wave. It was shot on a 5D Mark IV at 720p at 120 frames per second. It was actually shot in this little dinky Dyka water housing that's like $100 or something. And I was just scrubbing through this clip and I noticed that the camera follows her up over the wave. The camera holds on the clouds for a second and then drops down. So I had the idea, what if, the camera goes up towards the sky and then as it's coming down, it reveals to a new environment. So what I did was I took the clip in Premiere and dragged it to a new sequence called Transitions. And that was a sequence where I kept a lot of my ideas for the project for any kind of transitions or special effects. I kept scrubbing through my timelines, looking for other footage that could potentially work for this transition. And then I came across this drone clip of a drone in the clouds in Bali, moving just above the clouds with a volcano in the background, and then it eventually goes into another cloud. So I just sped up the clip a little bit to make it look more like a time lapse, and I thought that would work really well. So in order to make this transition look realistic, I knew that I had to get the camera tracking data from the first clip of the camera starting before the wave, going over and then back down. The second thing I knew I needed was a clean plate of the background. Now, the reason I knew I needed a clean plate of the background from the first clip was because I knew once the camera went over the wave, we were going to be working in a completely new environment and we would basically have to artificially extend the background of that environment. Now, maybe that doesn't make too much sense to you right now, but you'll see through the breakdown process exactly why we needed the clean plate to make this possible. So knowing that those two things were going to be most important in making this transition possible, those are the two things that I started off with. So with that being said, let's jump right into it and show you guys the exact process of how I put this together. So I knew that the camera moved in various directions once it passed the waves. So I went to one part where the camera pans furthest to the left, furthest to the right, furthest up, and furthest down, and I exported a TIFF photo for each one of these frames. And basically my plan was to stitch all of these photos together in Photoshop to make one large clean plate. Now, the way that I would export an individual TIFF frame from my footage is I would just go to the area I wanted to export, hit B and N, so it would trim your work area to that individual frame, and then you could just go ahead and export that as a TIFF and it will export only that one frame. And I did this for 3 separate frames of the clip. So before I took all of these images into Photoshop to make one panoramic image for the clean plate, I wanted to make sure that I can get a good clean track from the background of this footage. So what I did was I cut the clip at the point where I needed it to start tracking at, and I opened it in Mocha. So analyzing the footage, I could see that there weren't any specific dark contrasty points that we can use to get a solid track within After Effects. And because the background was out of focus, that wouldn't make it any easier. But thankfully we had some texture and separation in the clouds between these dark and white clouds, so we could potentially use those to get a solid track within Mocha. So first thing I did was use the X-Spline tool to create a mask around these contrasty clouds in the sky, and I tracked forwards. Now at this point, I saw that the mask started to wander and things were getting a little bit hectic. So I went back and repositioned the mask before things started to wander again. I made another mask around Chelsea and set the layer properties blend mode to subtract. So Mocha would basically track her as well as the background that I've selected. And because I knew that she was going to protrude into our original mask, Mocha would basically track her mask and subtract it from our original mask. So I tracked forwards and tried that again. and it looked like it was doing a pretty good job. I had to go into some of the frames and manually modify the mask. And when it got to the end, I saved it, went back into After Effects, created a new null object. I went into the Mocha effect and created new tracking data from the layer that we needed. And then I selected the transform option, applied it to the null, and then applied the export. And as you can see, as I scrub through, it looks like the null managed to latch on fairly well. So I created a new solid and parented that to the null to see if it would move in space and look like it's actually attached to the background. Now, it didn't do a terrible job, but throughout the track, we could see that it starts to get a little bit jittery throughout, and the scale of the object is jumping in and out. Now, because I was tracking something that was so far back in space, I knew that I only needed the position and rotation data. The scale didn't really matter. So I turned off the scale keyframes within the null, and then I tested it out again. Now, we weren't getting as much jump with the scale this time, but we were getting a lot of rotation issues. We can see that the rotation was very jittery towards the end. So I went back into Mocha again, readjusted the masks, and played around with it one more time. And you can see that I failed again after my second attempt, so I deleted the mask and tried it one more time. I selected a wider range this time and gave that a try. I had to refine my mask several times throughout the track. Then I went back into After Effects and tested out the new track to see if the green solid would stick to the background like we want it to. And after my third time trying to get a solid track, it was a success, so I moved on to the next step, which was creating that clean plate. So I created a new document within Photoshop and started importing the different individual frames I exported from the clip. So one by one, I would drag them into the Photoshop document and try to position them in space where I think that they belonged. So to line up these images as accurately as possible, what I did was I would lower the opacity and move them over top of the other images so I could see through the top image and line it up perfectly with the background image. So holding Command and Shift together allows you to individually move each corner of your frame, kind of warping your image. And in this case, that was very helpful. I then rasterized the layer and then grabbed the eraser tool and started erasing away at the edges of the frame to blend both the images together. Now you can see that the overlapping image is a bit darker than the background. I then selected that layer, went to adjustments and selected curves, and played around with the curves to better adjust the light to match the background. That looks much better. I then merged both of the layers so that they would now be one image. And I grabbed the clone stamp tool and started to paint in the right side of the image that was missing. Now with the patch tool, I traced Chelsea and took her out of the frame. I then used the spot healing brush tool to go in and remove every single little speck of water that was in the air from the splash of the wave. I then did some more adjustments, cleaned things up a little bit, and then saved this as a JPEG in the project file. Then I went back into After Effects and imported this new photo. I then dragged it into the timeline and had to reposition it so that it would sit perfectly on top of the original footage. So using the same method as in Photoshop, I lowered the opacity and moved it over top of the original footage and tried to line it up perfectly. I used the corner pin tool in After Effects to adjust each corner to basically warp the image to perfectly sit over top of our original footage. Toggling the clean plate on and off, you could see whether or not it sits perfectly on top of our footage. Took me a little while to get the corners right, but I eventually got it dialed. I then parented the clean plate to the null object that held the tracking data for the background and watched it move around in space. I cut the clean plate at the point where we needed it to start and deleted the rest before that point. So obviously we couldn't have the clean plate just abruptly show up, so we had to animate the opacity at the start of the clean plate so that it would slowly fade in. So next, I masked out the bottom of our clean plate because we didn't need the water over there. We really just needed the sky. Scrubbing through the timeline, I could see that the transition could be a bit smoother, so I made one more adjustment to the clean plate and lined it up just a little bit better over top of our original footage. So now that I had those two things, a good track and a clean plate tracked to the original background, I knew that the odds of this transition being a success were a lot higher. I then cut the original wave clip at the point where the transition starts. I then took the second clip, the drone clip, and threw it into the timeline and started playing around with the timing of it. I scaled it up to fit the composition, and then I parented it to the null object so it would take on the transform properties of the null object and look as though it is tracked to the background of our first clip. I then positioned it to where I thought it would look best coming into frame. I then grabbed a color key, threw it onto our drone clip, and tried to key out the sky. Now, as you can see, it definitely struggled to separate the sky from the volcano and the clouds because they're all very consistent colors. So I basically just went through the entire drone clip and manually masked out the clouds, which didn't take too long because it's a pretty short clip. I set the mask to add, and then I had an isolated layer of just the clouds. Then I duplicated the drone clip and deleted the mask from the copy. I then went into my effects panel, grabbed the Luma key effect, and applied it to the copy of the drone clip. I set the key type to key out brighter, and I started to key out the brighter parts of the image. And now that we don't have to worry about the clouds being affected because we have them as a separate layer, we were able to isolate the volcano from the sky. And the sky that remained up top wasn't a problem because we can easily mask that out. I then selected both the volcano layer and the clouds layer and moved them both up to hide the black space in between both of the clips. So as I scrubbed through the beginning of the transition, I felt like the movement of the mountains was a little bit off. So I went in and manually changed some of the position keyframes of the null object to make it flow a bit nicer. I'll find myself watching it back over and over and over again, trying to look for any imperfections or anything that looks off. I then duplicated the original wave video and dragged it to the top of the composition. I then went in frame by frame and masked out just the wave. Isolating the wave by masking it out and putting it on top of all the other layers gives us the illusion that the volcano and the clouds are behind the wave. I then renamed some of the layers to stay organized. I then grabbed the curves effect and started playing around with the volcano clouds layer to try to color correct the clouds so that they would match the first clip. I also applied the hue and saturation effect and turned down the overall saturation and lightness of the image, and that helped a lot with matching the two different shots. So this isn't necessarily color grading, this is more just color correction. I'm correcting the colors and the brightness of the second clip to match with the first clip. I then turned back on the volcano layer. Now remember, I applied the curves effect to this layer in order for the Luma key effect to work better at taking out the sky. And because I played with the curves, it took out the sky, but it changed the colors of our clip. And in this case, they look very blue, and I don't like the way that it looks. So what I did was duplicate the layer and took off both the curves and Luma key effect on the bottom layer, which gave me back my unedited original clip. I then set the track matte for the bottom layer to Luma matte the top layer. I essentially then had the same cutout that I had before, except this time it was applied to a clip that didn't have any Luma or curves effects on it. I then copied the curves and saturation from the isolated cloud layer and applied it to the new volcano layer. This step unified the colors between the isolated volcano layer and the isolated cloud layer. I then went into the isolated volcano layer and played with the curves in there to make the volcano pop a bit more. I then went into the isolated volcano layer and masked out any of the clouds that were remaining down below. I went through the timeline and animated the mask to make sure it covered the area it was supposed to. I then had to play with both of the masks from the isolated cloud layer and the isolated volcano layer to make sure that there were no gaps or imperfections between the two. Now the next step was to fix the left side of the clean plate. We could see that the clean plate was not filling up the entire frame and it would expose the original background on the left side over there, so we had to extend it. So what I did was go back to our clean plate layer and duplicate it. I then flipped the duplicated clean plate horizontally and moved it over to the left side. I then lined up the edges of both of the clean plates to essentially extend the original clean plate over to the left even more. Now, because it only takes up a little bit of space on the left side of the frame, most people won't even be able to notice it. I then again went into the isolated volcano layer and played around with the saturation to better match the background. I then noticed that the volcano was a little bit too crisp and didn't blend in with the background, so I added a Gaussian blur effect and turned up the blurriness just a little bit. The next thing I did was turn on motion blur for every single layer to make things flow a little bit smoother. So at this point, I realized that the beginning of the transition was still not to my liking. I felt like the tracking information in the null was really good throughout the rest of the clip, but the beginning, it was a little bit off. So I decided to make a new null object and manually set the position keyframes at the start of the transition. So I went to the start of the wave clip where the transition starts. I positioned my null object on the top of this white cloud that I could see throughout the frame and started manually keyframing the position of this null object to that cloud. Once I completed that, I copied over those keyframes to the original null object. I then had to move the new keyframes into position on that null object. And then from there, I just made some minor modifications to some of the keyframes to make it perfect. And finally, I was able to get the track to a place where I was happy with it. So at this point, scrubbing through the transition, I realized that maybe the volcano and the clouds are not really in a realistic position. I felt like they might be a little bit too high in the frame in relation to the background clouds. So what I did was I went into my project panel and duplicated the original sequence because I was about to do some more drastic experimentation and I didn't want to ruin the original sequence. So I selected all 3 layers, the volcano layer that we're using as the Luma track map for the volcano layer below it, that layer, and also the isolated cloud layer. With all 3 selected, I changed the position of those layers and moved them down within the frame. Now at this point, I felt like it looked a lot more realistic. It was clear to me that the position of the volcano and cloud layer was too high earlier on and it just didn't look realistic. So now because we dragged those drone clip layers down, we are now exposing the background of the composition, which is just black, and we're gonna have to do something about that. Next, I went into the isolated cloud layer and animated the mask that was isolating those clouds and moved it up so it would reveal more of the sky behind and essentially cover the transparent parts that were exposing the background of the composition. Then I duplicated the original clean plate and basically did what we did before on the left side of the image, but down below this time. So I flipped it vertically and pushed it down to extend the clouds downwards. I then went into the isolated cloud layer and played with the curves again to better match the new exposed sky to the background. So I then realized that the mask extension I did on the isolated cloud layer was a little bit excessive. So I basically pushed that mask back down to how it was before. So I wouldn't look at that as a waste of time. I was basically experimenting with 2 different options, one exposing a bit more of the sky from the cloud layer and one without. And then I realized without that extra sky, things just look a little bit better. Now, because there's so many different layers, so many things happening, I created a new black solid and created a vignette effect on top of all of this to make the corners of everything a little bit darker. And because it's affected to all the layers, it kind of glues things together and makes it look more seamless. I then parented that vignette to the original null that holds all of the tracking data so that it moves within our frame. I then keyframed the opacity so that that vignette would slowly fade in at the start of the transition. At this point, I was pretty much done. The last thing I did was just go into each individual layer and play with the colors a little bit more to make everything match perfectly. I then exported what I had as a ProRes 422 HQ file, brought it back into After Effects, and I applied an effect called RSMB, Real Smart Motion Blur. It's a third-party plugin you can download online. It basically applies artificial motion blur to your footage, and in this case, it helped sell the effect so much more, made it look a lot more realistic. Now, the very last step is, of course, to color grade it. I did some minimal color grading to this. I really like the way that it looked after my initial color correction between the 2 clips, but adding one last layer of color to this just helped glue all the different elements together and make it look that much more seamless. So there you have it. That is the wave transition breakdown. I know this was definitely a longer video, but I wanted to go through the entire process from start to finish. I'm curious, what do you guys think? Did you guys enjoy it? Was it too long? Do you think I could have condensed things, or do you think I could have slowed things down and gone into even more depth in certain areas? I want to know what you guys think, so let me know in the Facebook group. But this was definitely a very long video for me to film, so I think I'm gonna go jump in the ocean or something now. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.